Why, once you actually have missionaries and Bibles in religious institutions, why would the Southern whites be leery of letting black slaves have too much contact with that? Are there any themes in the Bible that might, raise people's hopes and aspirations? Think back to Judaism, when we talked about,
The book of Exodus with Moses.
Yeah, and Moses becomes a really key figure in a lot of African spirituals. And Egypt would be who? I mean, the Hebrews were slaves at that time, right? So who would the Egyptians be? The plantation owners? So, the Bible's full of things like that. And if you let people read it, this is sort of like talking about the Protestant Reformation. If you let people read the Bible directly, they'll often find things in there that you don't want them to find. And so, restricting access to that sort of thing was one way in which the white slaveholders could keep the black slave population down. Your book talks then about the 18th century and a number of different developments that work in the opposite direction. The opposite direction of what? The opposite direction of there not being an awful lot of mission work done among African Americans. As the economy develops, as communications develop, churches start to spring up. And Southerners themselves become, in sort of demographic terms, more religious. And along with that goes African Americans becoming more religious because they're part of that economy. Some of the worries that they had was, well, if you let these people be baptized, then they'll become part of the religious community. And then how are Christians supposed to treat each other? Are they supposed to enslave each other, generally? No. So there were worries that if you allowed baptism, then, baptized slaves, it starts, saying, we're equals. And that would really go not only against cultural mores, but the economy of the South was intrinsically dependent on slavery. So, your book talks about colonial legislatures making sure that wasn't actually going to be the case. There was some mission work, not an awful lot, more of it towards whites than towards blacks. Your book also points out Catholics in Louisiana and Maryland, including slaveholding Jesuits, were more conscientious than most in providing some religious instruction. But for the most part, they're kind of left on their own. Then your book talks about the Great Awakening, and we've focused on this quite a bit. Why is the Great Awakening important? Well, it raises certain denominations. What are some of the denominations that you remember being really small before the Great Awakening and then start sort of taking off? Any come to mind? Yeah.
The Baptist Church?
Yeah, it started out being just two little churches in Rhode Island. And by the end of the 18th century, there's quite a few of them. By the end of the 19th century, they're one of the dominant forces in American Protestantism. And some of that growth takes place in the South. So, remember how we talked about Baptist churches being very portable, very easy to move from place to place, to spring up? Baptists and Methodists are coming out of the Great Awakening, and they're doing some mission work in the South. Now, we got to be a bit careful in thinking about the history involved here, because it's not as if the Baptist churches came down south and immediately started missionizing African American slaves. Instead, sometimes there would be, looking at the Baptist model and doing things along those lines without actually being in any sustained contact with them. And then later on, when you ask, well, what denomination are you? It would be easier to say Baptist than Methodist than other things as well. So, your book talks about something they call the invisible institution. What they mean by this is sort of indigenous African American communities. of religion, where religion is taking place. So they say the more authentic indigenous Christianity that emerged among the slave communities between the Great Awakening and the Civil War is frequently described as the invisible institution. Why? Because it's invisible from the outside, and it doesn't have any sort of legal status. These are people who are being sort of, placed at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. So what went on with that? There's very little organization, but there's a lot of ferment. There's a lot of sort of new ideas, new approaches coming in. And so your book talks about the religious lives of plantation blacks having kind of a split quality. Are you guys familiar with this term compartmentalization? For any of you sociology majors or psychology majors? If you compartmentalize your life, what do you think that means? Like you're a student right now, right? Do all of you think of yourself as students all the time? What are other roles that you have that you think about that really matter to you? A student matters to you, I think. But hopefully you're not studying constantly. What else? You guys are athletes. That's a role, right? Sometimes you can't do both at the same time. What else? What are other key roles that are very different than being a student? Yeah.
Son.
Family relationships, a son, daughter. Hopefully nobody in here has yet a mother or father, but someday down the line. Brother, sister, that sort of thing. That's very different than being a student. And you might have certain expectations of yourself as a son or daughter that are radically different from that of being a student. For example, under the FERPA law, your mom and dad can't see your grades. Back in the day, they could. And you sort of straddle two different worlds. You go home on vacation, and now, I don't know, do they still treat you somewhat like a kid? Some of your parents? You're still the little boy or girl. And you say, I'm 20, I'm 21, I'm 22. You got to knock this off. I'm old enough to do X, Y, Z. There's that tension there, right? And that's what we call compartmentalization. When you start splitting your life into these different things, you might end up doing that later on with work and with family, having two very different ways of looking at the world. So that happens with plantation blacks. Why? Because there's this desire of white to utilize Christian teachings, like they say, especially certain texts of Paul that say slaves should obey their masters, to reinforce a spirit of obedience